I went into the Army in 2000 and signed in 2003, left for boot camp in 2004. I served in the Army in the 82nd Airborne Division as a paratrooper infantryman. So I was stationed down in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and eventually made it up to the rank of E5 before I got out in 2008. So I spent a little over 4 years in the Army. As you know, 9/11 happened, and I was a teenager at the time. And I had this was about 6 months after 9/11. I had a girlfriend that was a camp instructor. And I went up and visited her and stayed at a campground next to where I couldn't stay with her in the cabin, so I had to stay off. And the guy that was running the campground had asked me to just, help him chop some wood up. He was a elderly guy, probably 65, 70, and he was listening to a radio at the time. We were chopping some wood, and he didn't charge me for the campground, which is perfect because I was a 18, 19-year-old kid. And he asked me, the news came on talking about the war, and he asked me why I wasn't there, and I didn't have a good answer for him. And so that kind of stuck with me, and I talked about it with my girlfriend that night, and about 2 months later, I was in the recruiter's office. The first couple of days of the Army, before you even get to boot camp, you're sort of in this holding tank, having your head shaved and your blood taken and all your medical and your physical, essentially starting your personal packet of information, that you'll carry with you throughout your entire career. And it was miserable, to say the least. Some people had it a lot worse than I wasn't in tears or, I wasn't crying to try to make a call home or trying to escape or anything, but there was people around me that were trying to do all those things. So it was sort of a miserable 72 hours of tests taken. And I went to Iraq first, and that was about 6 months after 4 months after I got to my unit. So I was fairly new, still trying to get my feet wet and gain the trust of everybody. I spent 6 months in Iraq, went probably 5 days after Thanksgiving, and we went originally for the inaugural Democratic elections, and so we were assigned and tasked to pull security around some of the more heavy populated areas in Baghdad. So we took over and fortified one of Saddam's palaces. He had many, and I don't know what kind of value it held, but it was nice because it was in walking distance from every aspect that we had to control and oversee. So it was a pretty hectic time. They obviously didn't like us in his palace. They didn't like us pulling security to allow people to vote. So there was, we always kind of slept with one eye open. We were attached to being paratroopers in a ground unit. We weren't used to tanks, but that was the unit that they attached us to. So we had some tanks along with us, and being crammed in those were the worst of all experiences in Iraq. They crammed 12 of us in the back, and it was horrible. And we weren't used to it. We like to stretch our legs out, and but yeah, we spent 6 months there, and for the most part, people were allowed to vote. People were happy, so it felt like we did the job that we were asked to do. Roadside bombs weren't prevalent, but indirect fire was a pretty common thing from the palace. The palace was on the Tigris River, and so we had a nice fortified position, but there was tall buildings on either side, and tall buildings meaning 7, 8, 9-story buildings. A lot of windows, so it was sometimes hard to guard, and sometimes we'd keep smaller units outside in those apartment complexes just to little added security. But you know, I mean, indirect fire happened every day. It was common for the enemy to convince families to use their children as the enemy of the U.S. In exchange for food and money and you know, sort of life support. You know, so kids with grenades was a common thing. You know, 3-4 times a week. And then the Iraqi police unit was fairly new at the time, and we kind of took in to try to train them every now and then. But it didn't seem to work. They didn't seem like there was any sort of passion behind them, and we couldn't really trust them. You know, I never knew what was going to happen. And there would be a couple of times where they thought we were the enemy and shot at us, so then we started shooting back at them, and there was firefights amongst essentially two friendly units. So I mean, there was a bit of a mess there too with that. So I guess on a daily basis there would be something would happen.
Were you ever hit? Were you ever wounded?
No.
Do you feel fortunate?
Yeah. Yeah. I've been near. I've heard bullets fly, you know, near my head, presumably. I've had friends wounded, so yeah, I feel fortunate. I'm more stubborn, more knowledgeable. I'm calmer in situations that are chaotic. I've never met anybody that's never been in the military that has had that sort of training, that like real life, real mind training. So. So that's never going to go away. I'll never forget that, you know. So that in itself is worth it.